Welcome to Class 9, everybody, and a Happy New Year. We are going to talk about cultural value dimensions today. We're also going to do some media activities to understand this a little bit better. We're going to talk a little bit about project preparation. So I'm going to start by talking about cultural value dimensions. Okay, now I'm particularly going to base today's lecture on the work of a researcher and writer called Geert Hofstede, and he was born in 1928 in the Netherlands. So he's a very influential Dutch researcher in the fields of organizational studies, organizational culture, cultural economics and management. So he's a very well-known pioneer. He's very well known as a pioneer, should I say, in his research on cross-cultural groups and organizations. He's one of the kind of seminal works that one of the kind of writers and one of the models he's come up with is one of the most influential in the field of intercultural communications. I suppose it was research that took place in many different parts of the world and over many, many years. So he has a lot of influence, but like all of these models are just frameworks and lenses. They're sort of, the way I see them, are kind of ways into thinking about culture and intercultural communications. It doesn't mean that one model is right and the other one is wrong. You yourselves, as you come across different models of looking at intercultural communications, you yourselves will like some more than others. It also doesn't mean that it's black and white, as I'll explain in a second. It's not like one culture fits neatly into one box that he talks about, and another culture fits in neatly into another box. Life is more complex than that. But I do think that his model will offer some good ways in which you can think about culture and intercultural communications, or begin to do so anyway. So he's very well known for what's called the 6 dimensions of cultural values. And those 6 dimensions are identity, context, power, uncertainty, sex roles, and time. And we are going to look at these 6 dimensions today one by one. So under identity, for example, and just very broadly for now, he talks about individualistic versus collectivist cultures. Under context, he talks about high context versus low context cultures. Under power, he talks about small power distance versus large power distance. Under uncertainty, he talks about weak uncertainty avoidance versus strong uncertainty avoidance. Under sex roles, he talks about feminine versus masculine cultures. And under time, he talks about long-term versus short-term cultural values. So we're going to go through them and see what this actually means in a little bit more detail. Just on this slide here, you've got a reference which you can have a look at on the PowerPoint. So that this is where a lot of this work, it's just a reference to where you can find more information about this piece of research, which I'm not really expecting you to take a look at as such. You don't need to read the full works at this point in your careers. So the first one that he talks about is identity, one's sense of identity, and he talks about individualism versus collectivism. So this is about the degree to which individuals are integrated into groups. So he's saying that in individualistic societies, the stress is put on personal achievements and individual rights. And in collectivist societies, individuals act predominantly as members of a lifelong and cohesive group. Now, this does not mean that everybody, as I said, fits neatly into one or the other, or every culture fits neatly into one side or the other. So if you think of a line, and what he's saying is cultures are in different places on that line. So just a straight line, and on the left-hand side of that line, you've got people cultures who are very individualistic, and on the other side, you've got cultures that are very collectivist. and most cultures are somewhere in between, and but it's a way of thinking about culture. So it's more that certain cultures have an orientation towards towards being individualistic or collectivist. So what you could have a think about, and you might want to stop the video for a second, is in your culture, do you think that you come from a culture which is more individualistic or more collectivist? So you might, if you stop a second, you could have a think about that. And to give you some ideas of what that means, in individualistic cultures, there's a strong emphasis on the I, as opposed to in collectivist cultures, there's a strong emphasis on the we. So a lot of Eastern countries, or Asian countries, and some African countries, for example, and other parts of the world as well, when they think about the world, and when they, as cultures, look at the world, there's a strong sense of the community, the family, the extended family, and that's how they see the world. Like, the group is important, and how everybody is in the group, and that's how they think about the world. And so you can see that when those different kind of cultures kind of come together, very individualistic cultures and very collectivist cultures, that it can be difficult, because you're coming from a different framework and lens by which you see the world. So, like, if you could imagine in a business context, for example, and you have a team of people coming from a very individualistic culture and a team of people coming from a very collectivist culture, they're going to do things differently. So they have to understand each other. And this is why in a business context, for example, business people do study these things in order to understand what's the best way of carrying out business with this particular culture. And big companies spend, as I told you in the class, a huge amount of money in understanding how to communicate cross-culturally. And that goes not just for business, but in education and in other ways in which we communicate now at a global level. Okay, so in individualistic cultures, the nuclear family, as in the smallest unit of community or of family, is very important. And that family might be just 2 people, it might be 3 people living in the same household or whatever, or a very, very small unit of people who live together in a small place. So, for example, 2 parents and 2 children, or that would be a nuclear family, as opposed to an extended family where there's a lot of people in the family. There's aunts and uncles, there's grandparents, and there's a lot of interaction between generations, for example. That would be more of a sign of a collectivist culture. In an individualistic culture, there's a very strong emphasis on privacy, as opposed to in collectivist cultures, a strong relational kind of harmony. So it's like you're seeing how everybody is in relation to one another, whereas the concept of privacy is different. And again, in an individualistic culture, each individual's personal life is very much something that's not shared as much as with a culture where there's a lot of where relations between one another are more important. Again, in individualistic cultures, there's a lot of individual competition, striving for individual achievement and personal competence, whereas in the collectivist culture, teamwork and emphasis on the in-group is more important. Again, we'll come back to this in a second, but there's a far more direct communication patterns in an individualistic culture, as opposed to indirect communication patterns in a collectivist culture, and I'll talk about that later. It fits somewhere else more, really. And again, the independent self, as opposed to the interdependent self. So that is interdependent. Each part of the group is important, relying on one another in the collectivist cultures. Okay, so you might have to think about your own culture and what do you think, where do you think you would fit as a culture on that spectrum? Are there parts of your culture that are more collectivist than others? So for example, some cultures might have business which is more individualistic, and yet their family life might be more collectivist. But in general, you know, I want you to think about your own culture and your own orientation as a culture and where you think you are. So moving on then to the next slide, it's about power distance. Okay, so this is the second dimension that Hofstede talks about. This dimension applies to the perception of power and authority by the less influential members of a given community. It is the extent to which the less powerful members of organizations and institutions accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. So if you go to this slide, in a small power distance culture, there is a very strong emphasis on interpersonal equality, whereas in a large power distance culture, there's an emphasis, they emphasize status based on difference. So to give you a more concrete example, I was working, as I said to you, in the class in the Lesotho group. I was working with a group of German students recently and a group of Irish students. And one of the things that emerged for the German students is that they were quite surprised that the Irish students were calling their lecturers, i.e. me, by their first names. And in their culture, it would be a very unusual thing to do, because there's far more of a distance between the lecturer and the student. So in relation to that sort of thing, you know, it's not as extreme as in other cultures, but in that kind of thing, there was a difference between the cultural way of doing things in Cork versus in the university, in this German university. So that was about power distance. So it's kind of the distance between the lecturer and the student is different. There was a definite, more almost informal, you know, kind of relationship in one, where using the status of the lecturer wasn't as far away from the status as a student as in the German context. And this is something that the German students wrote about in their reflections and were very interested in. And when we talked about this with the Lesotho group in the classroom as well, the group there felt that in their culture as well there would be more of a distance between a lecturer and a student. And I think you guys found that kind of interesting as well, you know. So in that kind of a culture then, other examples of this are the relationship between children and parents, where there's a small power distance. Children can contradict parents, but I've come across many cultures in my work where children are kind of should be seen and not heard sort of thing. Children should obey parents. There's a far more of authority, so there's a far bigger distance between the parents and the children. So that will be within the family context. And cultures change over time. I certainly feel that when I was a child, there was more of an orientation towards the authority of the parent than there is now. It's changed. It's not changed maybe dramatically, but there has been some changes. So cultures do change over time. In these kinds of cultures as well, younger people are seen as smart, but quite often in the large power distance kind of culture, you find that older people are revered and seen as quite wise, whereas in the small power distance, the younger people are considered as smart and appreciated in a different kind of a way than in the large power distance type of situation. In this, again, as I said, teachers might look for feedback, whereas teachers lecture when there's a large power distance. Okay, so in a small power distance relationship, subordinates expect consultation. They're expecting their bosses to be consulting with them, whereas in a large power distance, for example, in a work context, the subordinates are are looking for and expecting guidance from their management. So again, far more informal communication patterns in the small power distance, and more formal communication patterns in the large power distance culture. Okay, so that's that one. So number 3 then is masculinity versus femininity. Now, so it's in masculine cultures, there's a value is placed on success, money, material possessions, whereas in feminine cultures they place more value on relationships and quality of life. In masculine cultures, the differences between gender roles are more rigid and less fluid than in feminine cultures. Masculine cultures are those that used to be at war more often, or are at war more often, should I say, while feminine cultures are those in which men and women had to support each other in order to persevere in harsh life conditions. Now, I suppose people get mixed up a little bit on this. It doesn't mean that, from a culture perspective, it doesn't mean that all men behave in this way and all women behave in this way, in another way. That's not what it's about, although that can be maybe some part of it, but it's really more about the culture as a whole, having a masculine approach to life as opposed to a feminine approach to life. Okay, so you could have, for example, a group of men within a culture which is a feminine culture who are behaving in a feminine way, or with a femininity approach, I suppose. So with a feminine culture. So don't get confused between the idea of all men do this and all women do that. It's more the culture as a whole, and then he defines what a masculine culture looks like and what a feminine culture looks like. Okay, so if again coming to the masculine feminine value pattern, in a feminine culture there is far more flexibility of sex roles. Okay, there is a tendency for for men or women to be in different kinds of jobs, for example, or different kinds of, so if you think of the household, for example, men and women will do the different types of tasks. So men and women will be, washing the car or changing the tires in the car, or men and women will be doing the washing the dishes. Much more fluidity between who does what. Whereas in the masculine cultures, there's more of a distinction between men and women. A man will, I suppose, do certain types of work, and women will do certain types of work, and it's far more emphasized. Okay, so again, in the feminine culture, there's more of an emphasis on nurture, whereas in the masculine culture, there's more of an emphasis on achievement. Okay, so this might link into some of the other cultural dimensions that we talked about as well earlier. So that identity being around achievement, for example, in that identity, it links very much in here to the masculine culture of emphasis on achievement. So again, in the feminine culture, both genders take an initiative. In a masculine culture, the initiative is taken more by the male. In the feminine culture, social adjustment is critical, whereas in the masculine culture, an academic performance is more important. Okay, in a feminine culture, people work in order to live. In a masculine culture, people live in order to work. And we could all think of cultures that we've come across that fit into one or the other. There's far more fluidity in gender communication. Whereas in the masculine culture, There's the kind of a masculine toughness versus a feminine kind of softness. And again, overlapped sort of gender roles versus clear masculine, feminine gender roles. And again, as I said earlier, it's not like we're all either on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of this line. Cultures are at different places on that spectrum. But it just gives you a way of thinking about culture again, and again, something for you to think about when you think of a feminine or a masculine kind of approach to your cultural patterns in your community or in your culture. What do you think? Where do you think you stand? Do you think that your culture is a very feminine or a very masculine culture if you look at some of these dimensions? And do you think it's changed over time as well? And I think particularly those of you who are a bit older might have an appreciation of how things have changed or not changed. How static is your culture? How ingrained is it? Has it changed in more recent years in relation to some of these value patterns? Okay, so we move to the next one now, and it's called uncertainty avoidance. So in one cultural set, you've got high uncertainty avoidance, and this stems from striving for truth and the belief that it is in fact cognizable, whatever that is. I'm sorry about that word. This conviction is important in the Western relationistic tradition. It can be juxtaposed with the Eastern pursuit of virtue stemming from Confucius philosophy. Okay, let's go to quickly to the next slide. So weak, strong, uncertainty, avoidance, value patterns. Okay, so this is a little bit harder to follow, I suppose, initially when you think what are we talking about here? Weak uncertainty avoidance and strong uncertainty avoidance. Okay, what this is about is that being uncertain and not knowing sort of what's going on is seen as a threat, or is very difficult in some cultures. Some cultures like to know, like they like to have rules, regulations, they like to have certainty. They like to have certainty in how things are in their world. Okay, so if you take again within the family context, for example, when there's a strong uncertainty avoidance in a culture, this culture wants to reinforce family rules. The same can be said in the workplace. Okay, routine is important. Okay, conflict is not a good thing. There is a very low tolerance for ambiguity. Clear procedures are very important. Okay, whereas in a different kind of culture where there's a weak uncertainty avoidance, they kind of value uncertainty. It's something that they don't feel that is a difficulty. They don't find that it's a threat. The family is dynamic and changing. There's a high mobility in relationships. Challenges are welcome. Conflicts can be a very positive thing. There's a high tolerance for ambiguity. And there's risk-taking is encouraged. Okay, so I suppose, just to think of the family again, not as many rules and regulations going on. Very often as well, not as much distance between the authority of the parent and the child, for example. So it links into some of the others. I suppose in a family situation it might be a little bit more chaotic as well. I mean, it's not like, we have to get up in the morning at a certain time and we will set out a plan for the day of what we're going to do. It's much more fluid. It's much more, what happens, what are we going to do today? As the day goes on, plans might change. And that feels okay to them. Whereas in another type of culture, that could be a really difficult thing to deal with. And again, you can imagine in business communication or in in communication between cultures in an educational context or something like that, or if you're doing a project with people online or something, you might find that in one culture they're saying, oh God, we are going to have like 4 meetings online, and we're going to have an agenda for each one. We're going to turn up at 2 o'clock, and it has to be on a Monday afternoon every week. For another type of culture, that could actually be very difficult, and it's very hard sometimes for cultures to understand one another in that way, because they have a different way of seeing the world, and maybe having a conversation, having a chat about how's your family or the weather or something like that is more common in a different kind of a culture than the one I just talked about. So they're sort of figuring out, how do I, somehow we have to figure out in here, how does the other operate, and to what extent can we accommodate one another, and how do we work around some of this? And that's all part of intercultural communications. So the next one then is the time dimension of culture, the concept of time. Different cultures have different approaches to the idea of time. They can have a long versus a short-term orientation as cultures. Long-term orientated societies attach more importance to the future, and short-term orientated societies attach more importance to the past and the present. So, looking at this in more detail, long versus short-term time orientation. So a typical opinion of people from long-term orientated culture is that tradition needs to be adjusted to the present conditions. Or on the other hand, in a person from a short-term orientated culture, there is more of a respect for tradition. I mean, I think a good example here of what I mean is to do more with 2 things. One, a good example is the saving for future investment, or no money being saved for investment. Okay, so people from a long-term orientated culture are willing to, are able to save for future investments, whereas in a person with a short-term orientated culture, no money is saved for investments. And this relates to the idea of expecting delayed gratification or expecting immediate gratification. So in some cultures you might spend a lot of time and effort into your education, for example, and you are hoping that the rewards will come more in the long term. Whereas in a culture where there is a short-term orientated culture, you're looking for more immediate gratification. You want to go out and work now, and you want to get the rewards of that without putting in the efforts over many, many years. And that's just an example of the difference between a culture which is short-term or long-term orientated. Now, in sometimes, of course, this is an economic necessity in the examples I just gave. So you can see how the need to survive, for example, from hour to hour or from day to day, is going to influence the culture, of a society. So if you're in a situation as a culture or as a society, as a community, even it could be a community within a very wealthy country, you could be in a situation where you have to go out and spend a small amount of money that you have, and you can't invest it because you need it to feed your children, or you have to go out and work, for example, in the immediate future and not think about delayed gratification. So it's these things are complex and are mixed up with other areas, but these are the kinds of things that Hofstede is talking about, the different concepts of time and what time means, and what time the importance that time is placed, and that orientation towards the long term or orientation towards the short term. Within this as well, he talks about that idea of face, which some of you may have come across or not, but it's quite a hard thing to explain in some ways. But think of it as like the whole idea of avoidance of embarrassment. Now, this may not seem to relate very much to long versus short-term time orientation, but when Hofstede is talking about it, this is part of when he did his research. Cultures where there is a short-term time orientation would do anything to achieve a goal, whereas when there's a more long-term time orientation, the importance of losing face or gaining face is important. It's linked to the idea of respect, avoiding embarrassment for others as well as yourself. So in the next slide I've given you, and you can see it on the PowerPoint, I've given you a web link, and if you go to that you can read a little bit about, in more detail, about the concept of face. It's something that I think you need to read about and think about. It's much stronger in certain parts of the world, and it's a very, very key part of intercultural communications at a global level, something that there's a lot written about and a lot of work done, a lot of training and how to work with one another when you have these completely different, again, ways of being in the world. So whereas like self-respect might be very important in a Western type of a culture, in an Asian culture the idea of preserving face, preserving respect, is very important. So you wouldn't, for example, contradict a colleague in public, or an older person, like a parent. You wouldn't contradict a parent in public, for instance. You would be losing face for your parent and for yourself. It's a very important part of how people live their lives, not just in business but in life, community life, and that is a fundamentally different way of being in the world than the whole idea of it's just a different way of being in the world, and the whole idea of doing anything to achieve a goal, that idea of not losing face, not embarrassing people, and respect and all of that for one another is very important. So I would encourage you to maybe read a little bit more about that and find out a little bit more about it. So I mean, the whole notion and linked to that is fulfilling social obligations within reason, versus fulfilling social obligations no matter what the cost. Okay, so this is something that I think you need to go away and have a read about, but think of I'll give you further information about it as well at the end in another reference that I will give you. Okay, so then going on to the final one, we have high versus low context cultures. Okay, this division applies to the reliance on the immediate physical context in communication, and again, in a kind of situation where you're giving a lecture online, this is something that's kind of hard enough to explain, but they are his six dimensions of culture. It gives you ways of thinking about culture, and when you're working with other cultures, being aware of maybe some of the things that can go on and can happen, and how for both sides people need to negotiate these kind of patterns. Now in the classroom, and if you want to do it on the forum, anybody else as well, we did have an activity online where we analysed our own. So I asked the Lesotho group when we did the class online, what are some examples of your culture's value patterns? In other words, what is generally thought to be a good or important thing to do? In other words, reflect a bit on what we've been talking about today and see where your culture fits in. Do you think about these value patterns very often, for example? So I asked the group to talk about that in the class, and I'd be very happy if anybody would like to reflect on some of Hofstede on the forum, and where you think that your culture fits in to some of these dimensions. And some of them might jump out at you more than others. Are some thoughts about them that you have? The idea, for example, do you think culture changes or stays the same? Do you see changes in cultural patterns over the years or whatever, However, for the formal this week's kind of forum discussion, okay, one of the topics I'd like you to talk about on the forum, everybody in the group, would be how would you characterize your native culture using Hofstede's dimensions, and what makes you perceive it this way? So in other words, just have a discussion really on what we've talked about in this lecture. You know, where do you think your culture fits in all of this? You know, and just have a think about that. And your reflections as you've been listening to this on anything really that comes to your mind, having listened to this, and some of the things that jumped out at you and kind of struck you as being important. Some of the things you agreed with, some of the things you disagreed with as well. Okay, or some of the kind of, if you felt uncomfortable about any aspect of it, you know. But generally, how would you characterize your native culture using Hofstede's 6 dimensions? And then the deadline for this is the 15th of January. It goes on, if it goes on for a week before that, because I know after that, some of you started later, so if it goes on to the following week, 15 plus 7, the 22nd, that's fine, you know. But whenever you can, I would really appreciate if you could discuss that on the forum, that question. Okay. Now, in the class as well with Lesotho, we also did some media activities, and if you're interested, the others, it would be really nice if you could have a look at this film that I have given you a link to. It's My Big Fat Greek Wedding, and the film clip is there, and you will see there a kind of I don't know what you'd call it, a clash between two cultures. Now it's very exaggerated, but I think sometimes for the purpose of teaching, something exaggerated can be helpful to make the point. So you'll see two different ways of being in the world between two different families there, which is kind of funny actually, so you might enjoy it. It's not very long, so if you want to have a look for that. There's also something there, and it relates to the idea of losing face, to do with a Japanese snowboarder who during the 2008 Winter Olympics, he received a large backlash from his home country after wearing his country's uniform inappropriately. Let me see, and there's the link to that. I think that's an important example. That's a good example of the whole idea of face. And just have a read of that. It's very, very short, you know. And we discussed these in the class with the Lesotho group again. There are some links here on the slideshow, on the PowerPoint presentation, which may or may not work depending on your browser. But in any case, I've given you the web links anyway, so you can have a look at those. Okay. So for the Lesotho group, again on this slide it says the assignment is for the 22nd of December, but you can do it for the 22nd of January because with Christmas and everything. So in the next slide you will see the instructions. So if you go to the PowerPoint without the video, you'll be able to read this. So it's based on My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Okay. Now, the non-Lesotho people, the friends of the Lesotho group or whatever, you don't have to do this assignment. This is for the Lesotho group. So it's asking questions like, can you relate to the film? In your opinion, which value dimension created more cultural bumps? And give some examples of that. Have you ever experienced something similar with your friends? Which of the 4 cultural values stood out the most in your own family socialization process? So if you were requested to train both families with your intercultural communication experience, suggest ways to minimize the miscommunication, misunderstandings between both families. Now, I mean, obviously, if any of the rest of you would like to help the Lesotho group to answer some of these questions for their assignment, you could discuss all of this on the forum as well. Okay, you're very welcome to. But officially, in terms of the assignment that you're sent to your tutor, this is the one that you have to do there. Okay, so it's a reflection really on the video clip that you looked at. Okay, And actually, in the next slide, going back to Hofstede, if you go to the website, that's at the top there, http gerthofstede.com, you can find your own country. Okay, so for example, I looked up Ireland, and I do think this is a little bit out of date, but if you look up Ireland, you can see where Ireland is placed in this framework, in terms of individualism, masculinity, etc. And it would be interesting to put in, if you're from Canada, for example, to see what this website kind of comes up with for you, and then you could think about and reflect on the forum maybe as to whether you agree or disagree with them. So what do you think of that? Okay, do you think the conclusions are accurate for your country? So a comment on the forum on that would be interesting, and I think you'd probably enjoy having a look at it as well and seeing what you think, whether they get it right or not. Okay, and then finally, then some further reading there for you if anybody wants to read any more. There's some references and some reading for you.